Piers Morgan went on the BBC this morning and said something you almost never hear on a Sunday politics show.
Well, what happened in 2016, 10 years ago? We voted to leave the European Union. I had an open mind. I voted to remain, but I said, OK, if Brexit is the brave new world and it's going to change our fortunes for the better, I would be the first to say great. And it's been a pretty well unmitigated disaster. So you talk about the series of events. Yes. But every prime minister, every government has to deal with events. This was a self-inflicted injury. When David Cameron called that Brexit referendum, he assumed he was going to win it. And who was it that sold this to the country? Nigel Farage, the snake oil salesman.
So that's on the BBC, the flagship Sunday programme. Not his own show where he can say what he wants. It's the corporation that has spent a decade carefully not saying exactly that. And this week, on the 10th anniversary of the Brexit vote, former Conservative Prime Minister John Major said this.
So what is it that they can see that nobody else anywhere in the world can see? Who are the gainers from having left? I don't hear the Brexiteers talking much about Brexit these days because they know in their heart that it has failed to deliver what they promised. And what they promised, of course, was never going to be delivered. They were impossible promises.
Now, it's not often I could agree with the Conservatives. I mean, once every now and again. But here we are. We've got the man who spent decades inside the Conservative Party, who knows exactly what he's talking about and what he's saying. And we've got two establishment figures here, both in the same week, and both arriving at the same conclusion. So let's go through what Nigel Farage actually promised against what actually happened, and the very specific way he's been rewriting it ever since. January 31st, 2020, Parliament Square, the night Britain officially leaves the European Union.
And this is the greatest moment in the modern history of our great nation.
And on Boris Johnson, who would be responsible for implementing all of this.
But he's saying all of the right things. And in many ways, our hopes and our trust are now bound up with what Boris Johnson does.
Now, it is worth remembering that line, hope and trust bound up with Boris Johnson. Sounds crazy, doesn't it? Well, fast forward 3 years to May of 2023, and Farage is having another interview.
We should control our own borders and reduce the levels of immigration into Britain. I have to look at the figure, suggesting net migration could be running as much as 1 million a year, and say that it's been a failure. It's a failure because of the way this government has failed to implement it. So the failure of Brexit is to be laid fairly and squarely at the door of the Conservative government. They have chosen not to use the powers that we have with Brexit.
And then comes the line that tells you everything about what's actually going on here.
I made one promise in that referendum campaign in the previous 20 years. My promise was we would be back in control and the masters of our own destiny. And that's all I ever promised.
That's all I ever promised, he says. The man who called it the greatest moment in modern British history, who strangely trusted Boris Johnson, whose hopes and trust were bound up with him, and now telling you he only ever promised the small print. John Major had a precise response to that exact argument.
Well, it was an empty slogan. If we were going to take back control, to do what? To stop the boats coming? Well, that worked well.
To take back control of what exactly? Immigration hit a record 906,000 net in the year to June of 2023. The points-based system that was sold as the Australian model, Farage himself admitted in the same interview that it was actually lowered the bar at which you could enter the country and removed the upper cap entirely. On the single metric that Farage now claims he was always talking about, the Conservative government with full Brexit powers delivered the highest migration figures in British history. But the economic damage is where the numbers become really hard to look away from. And again, Major framed this very simply.
We have lost about £100 billion worth of trade each year. That £100 billion worth of trade would have yielded about £40 billion worth of tax to the exchequer. If we'd had that £40 billion annually over the last few years, many of the difficult and unpopular decisions that have been taken would not simply have been necessary.
Now, those aren't his numbers. That's the Office for Budget Responsibility, the government's own fiscal watchdog, has assessed that Brexit will reduce long-term productivity by 4% relatively to staying in the EU, and that UK trade with Europe will be 15% lower in the long run. The current GDP hit is around about 2 to 3%, and that's already, and it's supposed to rise to 5 to 6% by 2035, and investments down between 12 and 18%. And then there's the silence from the people who sold it loudest.
I mean, I think it was Michael Gove who said, after we leave, we will hold all the cards. Well, the only card they held were P45s for people who lost their jobs.
Boris Johnson, who promised there would be no increase in non-tariff barriers to trade with Europe, well, here's Major's verdict.
Well, there's been an enormous increase in non-tariff barriers, and it has seriously dented, seriously reduced the amount of trade we have with the European Union.
And on the people who now conspicuously very quiet about all of it,
well, I'd like to think there was a feeling of responsibility for what they have done, but I'm not sure that it is.
Farage's defence, and he will make it, he always makes it, is that the concept was sound and the execution was botched. If only the right people had implemented it. You know, the whole story of, oh, there was a great Brexit, it's just gone to a different school. So here's Major on that.
Well, if you're seeking to make Brexit succeed after 10 years, I think you are admitting tacitly that it has failed thus far. And it has failed thus far, and I think will continue to do so.
Now, you can always say that the execution was wrong. You can always say that we were betrayed. But what you can't do is go back to Parliament Square in 2020 and tell the crowd that your hopes and trusts are bound up with Boris Johnson, and then pretend 3 years later that you were always talking about something much narrower, and that none of this is anything to do with you. And you especially can't make that argument while welcoming into reform with open arms the very people who did the implementation. Suella Braverman, Home Secretary during the implementation years, Robert Jenrick, Immigration Minister, Nadine Dorries, Culture Secretary under Boris Johnson, the Boris Johnson whose hopes and trusts Farage were bound up with delivering Brexit. Reform's own head of policy at the time, Zia Youssef, called out Braverman and Jenrick by name in July of last year, asking who was in government during those failures. 5 months later, Farage had them both in the tent. That's not a man who genuinely believes that the Conservatives betrayed Brexit. That's a man collecting whoever's available. Major's final word on Farage was very straightforward.
Nigel Farage, of course, must have primary responsibility. He campaigned for this for a very long time. And it is something that has damaged our country, I won't say irreparably, but damaged it very significantly. And having done that, he now seeks more political power today.
Major's right, the OBR's right, the economists of Stanford and the Bank of England are right, and even Piers Morgan actually said something very sensible today.
I mean, the first thing Andy Burnham should do, other than call an election, is if he calls it and wins it, have another referendum. Ask the British public whether they still believe that Brexit has been a great success.
Well, he already said in his lifetime
I think
he would like to rejoin.
this country, you talk about landslides, I think this country would vote in a landslide to go back into the European Union, albeit in a leading role.
The snake oil salesman sold the snake oil. The snake oil doesn't work, and now he's telling you the problem was with the people who applied it, while building his front bench out of the very same people.